Ethan Vance had worked the floor at Lumina for exactly 3 years, mastering the quiet rhythm of the room. In that time, he had learned how to read a dining table within the first 30 seconds of approaching it. It was never about their menu preferences. Those details always came later. He read the psychological undercurrents. He knew exactly who was performing, who was actually in charge, and who held the silent power. And he knew who would make the next 2 hours completely unbearable for everyone within earshot. That Thursday evening, the moment Table 5 was seated, the dynamic was glaringly obvious to him. 3 men in custom-tailored suits, already treating the shared space like their own personal property. The loudest among them, Julian, laughed with arrogance before the first round of drinks even arrived. But sitting at the head of the table was a woman who said absolutely nothing at all. Victoria Sterling watched the room with the cold, unreadable detachment of someone entirely untouchable. The first real friction occurred when Julian demanded Ethan recite the entire wine list from memory. He didn't want to look at the menu. He wanted a performance to entertain his guests. Ethan complied without a single hesitation, his voice steady and completely devoid of irritation. He named 12 distinct vintages, their regions, and their complex profiles with surgical precision. Julian, dissatisfied with the flawless execution, shifted his focus from the wine to the man serving it. He leaned back in his expensive chair, a cruel, calculating smile forming on his lips. His eyes drifted downward, fixing on Ethan's clean, polished, but undeniably worn leather shoes. Julian remarked to his companions about the tragedy of men who spent their lives carrying other people's food. He questioned whether it took a special kind of limited ambition, or just a deeply limited mind. Dale and Greg laughed on cue, their voices filling the dining room with a sharp, ugly echo. Ethan set the crystal water pitcher down on the service station behind him with quiet precision. He turned back to the table, his movements unhurried and entirely composed. He looked directly into Julian's eyes, dropping the invisible barrier of subservience that usually protected guests. "I find meaning in doing one thing with absolute attention, sir," Ethan stated, his voice perfectly level. "Most people in rooms like this are doing 4 things at once, and failing at all of them.
Regardless of the human cost."
Julian's cruel smile began to falter, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. "You have been trying to impress this table since the moment you sat down," Ethan continued flawlessly. "It might be working on the 2 men whose opinions add no actual value to your life." Ethan's gaze shifted for a fraction of a second toward the head of the table. "But the only person whose approval you actually want hasn't looked at you in 20 minutes. The rest of the dinner proceeded without further incident. Julian became significantly more interested in his meal, the previous arrogance entirely drained from his posture. Victoria spoke only during the final 30 minutes, shifting the atmosphere into something strictly businesslike. She had quietly closed whatever performance the evening had briefly become. When the check finally arrived, Ethan brought it in a dark leather folder, setting it smoothly to Victoria's right, stepping back to allow her privacy. A few minutes passed. Julian, Dale, and Greg rose from the table with the flattened energy of men who knew the night had not gone as planned. Julian walked out without making eye contact with the man serving them, a silent, resentful acknowledgement of his own defeat. Victoria remained seated alone. She signed the receipt with a heavy gold pen, closed the leather folder, and looked up as Ethan returned to clear the remaining crystal glasses. Reaching into her tailored jacket, she withdrew a minimalist matte black card, just a name and a number, and placed it carefully on the pristine white linen. Beside it, she laid down a cash tip that represented roughly 3 times the total cost of the exorbitant meal they had just consumed. Ethan looked at the dark card, the stack of money, and then directly at her.
There is no escape.
"That is for your
from
professionalism tonight," Victoria stated evenly. Ethan picked up the leather folder, placed the cash neatly on top of it, and used one finger to slide the black card back across the table. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but absolute. "But that is not necessary." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with offense, but with something far rarer for her, genuine curiosity. "Most people in your position would keep it," she observed, studying his face for any crack in his composure.
have its limits?
"Respect isn't something I need to be paid for," Ethan replied smoothly. "I was doing my job. That is enough." He gathered the remaining glasses onto his silver tray, offering a small, polite nod. Carrying the exact same unbothered grace he had maintained all evening, he turned and walked back toward the service station. Victoria Sterling sat alone in the dimming light of the dining room for another 40 seconds. She stared at the matte black card, untouched on the white linen, exactly where she had placed it. It was the expression of a powerful woman encountering a situation she did not have an immediate psychological category for. Eventually, she picked up the card, slipped it quietly back into her tailored jacket, and stood to leave into the Manhattan night. Outside on the sidewalk, the cold Manhattan air offered little distraction from the encounter. Her waiting driver held the door to the black sedan, an everyday luxury she barely noticed. She got in without speaking. For the first 3 blocks, she did not check her phone. Her assistant would later describe this as completely unprecedented for a Thursday evening after a working dinner. Victoria sat with her hands resting in her lap, thinking about a man who had returned a golden ticket. She had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the most ruthless minds in Europe. She had never been easily unsettled. But Ethan's quiet refusal sat in her chest like an unidentifiable weight. She told herself it was merely professional curiosity, a fascination with rare self-possession. She told herself she might even find a corporate use for a man with that level of composure. But exactly 4 days later, Victoria Sterling walked back through the glass doors of Lumina. Victoria returned to Lumina on a busy Tuesday evening, intentionally bypassing her usual grand window table. She requested a smaller, unassuming table in the east section, directly within Ethan Vance's assigned service area. The floor manager noticed this unusual breach of her established protocol, but wisely said absolutely nothing. Ethan greeted her without a flicker of surprise, using her name, but offering no special deference. He poured her sparkling water with the exact same mechanical perfection he offered every other guest in the room. Victoria did not manufacture reasons to extend their interactions. She ordered simply and watched him work. She observed how he absorbed the chaotic, demanding energy of the dining room without ever letting it touch him. She returned the following Thursday, and then again on the Tuesday after that, always alone. By her third visit, the invisible distance between them had become a tangible, heavy presence in the room. Ethan knew she was studying him, calculating a new angle, but he steadily refused to step into the invisible trap. On her 5th visit, Victoria arrived not alone, but accompanied by Patricia Charles, a senior corporate attorney. Patricia carried the unmistakable posture of a woman who evaluated everything in terms of risk and liability. The dinner was clearly a working one, heavily structured around legal documents and low-volume negotiations. Ethan served the table with his usual efficiency, moving in and out of their conversation without intrusion. At the end of the meal, after Patricia had excused herself to the lobby, Victoria lingered at the table. When Ethan arrived to clear the final plates, Victoria looked up, dropping all social pretense. "I did some reading," she said, her voice dropping the conversational tone entirely. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, the crystal glass in his hand hovering just above the silver tray. Hartwell Technologies was a genuinely interesting company, Victoria continued, watching his eyes for any shift. "The decision to liquidate the founder's stake at the moment you did must have been a very difficult one." The microsecond of hesitation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan completed the motion, setting the crystal glass onto the silver tray without a single tremor in his hand. He did not look away, nor did he offer the defensive explanation she was clearly expecting. "It was a necessary decision, Ms. Sterling," Ethan replied, his voice entirely devoid of any tragic undertones. He spoke of a massive financial loss with the exact same detached professionalism he used to describe the wine list. "Will there be anything else for your table tonight?" he asked, smoothly shifting the power dynamic back to the present. Victoria sat in the ambient amber light, experiencing a profound and unfamiliar sense of powerlessness. She had brought a devastating piece of leverage to a transaction, only to find the other party refused to negotiate.
"The system is failing.
Thank you," Victoria murmured, her sharp corporate armor cracking just a fraction.
I just can't do this anymore."
Ethan nodded politely and walked away, leaving the billionaire alone with a secret that possessed absolutely no power over him. Victoria left Lumina that night with a quiet, unfamiliar sense of humility settling over her. For a woman accustomed to breaking down corporate giants, being rendered entirely powerless by a waiter was a complete paradigm shift. She returned to her penthouse, the cold city lights reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass as she stood in absolute silence. She realized she did not just want to solve the psychological puzzle of Ethan Vance, she genuinely respected him. Meanwhile, the following week at Lumina proceeded with deceptive, quiet normalcy. Ethan navigated the dining floor with the exact same precision, betraying no sign that his carefully guarded past had been breached. But the equilibrium was fragile, and Victoria Sterling was not a woman who left equations unfinished. On a rainy Thursday, precisely at the end of Ethan's shift, a private courier arrived at the restaurant service entrance. He silently handed Ethan a heavy, minimalist black envelope bearing the understated silver crest of Sterling Capital. Inside was an unyielding offer that contained numbers most men would gladly surrender their entire dignity to attain. Ethan stood alone in the rain-slicked alley, the heavy envelope feeling like a physical weight in his hands. He broke the silver wax seal with a quiet, deliberate motion, sliding out a single sheet of thick, watermarked parchment. It was the position of Director of Client Relations at Sterling Capital, offering an astronomical base salary and vast executive privileges. It was a golden bridge back into the high-stakes corporate world from which he had been so ruthlessly exiled. But Ethan did not see a bridge, he saw a meticulously constructed cage, built by someone who still treated his life as a problem to be solved with money. He read the staggering numbers twice, his facial expression remaining as impassive as the wet brick walls around him. He did not call the private executive number boldly embossed at the bottom of the page. Instead, he calmly folded the parchment, slid it back into the matte black envelope, and walked away into the rain. The following morning, the envelope arrived back at the reception desk of Sterling Capital via standard post, lacking any accompanying note. For Ethan Vance, absolute autonomy meant refusing to trade his hard-won peace for a price tag, regardless of how many zeros it carried. What ultimately shattered the fragile equilibrium between them was not Victoria, but the relentless, contextless machinery of the internet. A mid-tier financial publication ran a short, highly speculative article under a gossip-adjacent column called Industry Currents. It noted that Billionaire CEO Victoria Sterling had been observed dining repeatedly at Lumina, always served by the exact same man. The writer had dug just deep enough to connect the quiet restaurant worker to the early, lucrative days of Hartwell Technologies. By the following morning, the narrative had been aggressively amplified by business tabloids specializing in character demolition. The circulating headline was brutal and entirely devoid of nuance, framing Ethan as a failed tech founder desperately seeking a shortcut back to wealth. The subheading utilized the word angling, implying a calculated, parasitic seduction of a powerful woman. Ethan saw the article on his phone during a brief, quiet break in the narrow employee locker room. A former industry colleague had forwarded him the link, accompanied by nothing more than a solitary question mark. He read the damaging paragraphs twice in absolute silence, the harsh blue light of the screen reflecting in his steady gray eyes. He placed his phone face down on the metal bench, locking the screen and the noise of the internet away. Ethan finished his shift that evening by serving 9 tables with the exact same flawless precision he had always delivered. The only visible indication that anything had changed was a profound, chilling quietness between his interactions. But the guests noticed.
Is that really them?
The article had spread fast enough that several patrons recognized the man pouring their wine. They watched him not as a professional, but with the intrusive, dissecting attention people reserve for a public spectacle. One man at a corner table whispered to his companion, a cruel smirk clearly visible as Ethan turned his back. It was the kind of toxic attention that reduced a man's entire complex life to a single, humiliating narrative. But Ethan refused to perform the role of the disgraced founder on cue. He simply carried plates and refilled glasses without reacting. Before the restaurant opened the following morning, Ethan walked into the floor manager's quiet office.
We have a few things to discuss.
He submitted a brief, printed resignation letter, calmly stating it was a personal decision entirely unconnected to the restaurant. The floor manager, a man who rarely displayed emotion, looked at the printed letter and then at Ethan's unwavering face. He accepted it without argument, shaking Ethan's hand and offering a rare promise that the door would always remain open. Ethan thanked him quietly, packed his few belongings from the metal locker, and walked out the service door for the last time. He did not contact Victoria Sterling. He completely ignored the 2 missed calls from her private number later that afternoon. He also left unread the measured, carefully worded message her assistant sent, apologizing for the unexpected media disruption. For Ethan, this disappearance was never about anger directed at her, it was a matter of structural survival. He knew exactly how the massive gravity of other people's wealth and ambition could slowly pull a man out of his own orbit. He stood by the window of his modest apartment, watching the indifferent, continuous movement of the Manhattan streets below. He needed to stand on ground he had built entirely himself, completely free from the complex machinery of another person's success. And Victoria Sterling, for the very first time in her meticulously controlled life, found herself completely locked out. 3 full weeks passed. For the first time in her professional life, Victoria Sterling found herself without a viable strategy. She could acquire entire companies and restructure massive organizations, but she could not compel a man who had deliberately chosen silence. During this period, she engaged none of her vast resources. She did not ask her assistants to run a background search. The absence of a strategy forced her to confront a more straightforward, unfamiliar truth: she had genuinely wanted to understand him. Not as a corporate acquisition, and not as a psychological puzzle, but as a person whose interior life fascinated her. When waiting produced nothing, she finally went looking for him herself, navigating the city without her driver or security detail. Her search eventually led her to a narrow side street in the West Village, a neighborhood preserving the physical memory of an older New York. Between a faded laundromat and a closed hardware store, she found a narrow commercial space undergoing quiet renovations. A hand-lettered sign in the window read simply, "Vance's, opening soon," in plain black ink on white card. Victoria stood on the cold sidewalk, looking at the soft light inside, knowing with absolute certainty she had found him. She did not go inside that day. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, memorizing the location, and kept walking. She spent the next 2 days arguing with herself, trying to separate what she actually wanted from what she was merely accustomed to controlling. By the time she returned on the third afternoon, the brown paper was off the windows, revealing the clean, intentional lines of the interior. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. A small brass bell rang above it, a sound that seemed to briefly surprise the quiet room. Ethan Vance was standing behind the solid oak bar, holding an inventory sheet, checking bottles against a handwritten list. He looked up when the bell rang. The expression that crossed his face was not surprise, but the look of a man whose private calculations had just materialized. He set the inventory sheet down on the bar and waited, allowing her to set the parameters of the encounter. Victoria walked toward the bar and sat down on one of the unfinished wooden stools, shedding the last remnants of her corporate persona. "The space looks good," she said, looking at the unhurried arrangement of the room and meaning every word of it. Ethan nodded quietly. "Thank you. Would you like some coffee?" he asked, his voice steady, offering a simple hospitality entirely free of transaction. He poured the hot coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and set it in front of her without any unnecessary ceremony. For a long while, neither of them said anything that required an answer. The quietness of the room was comfortable, unforced. Outside the glass storefront, the city moved at its usual frantic pace, completely detached from the profound stillness inside. It was Victoria who finally broke the quiet. "I did not come here to offer you anything," she stated plainly. "I wanted to be clear about that first, because I understand that every time I approached you before, I brought a transaction." Ethan stood across the bar, listening with that rare, complete presence that did not require him to dominate the conversation. "I treated you like a problem that required a corporate solution," Victoria admitted, stripping away the last of her pride. "The tabloid article forced me to evaluate what I actually wanted, rather than what I am simply accustomed to acquiring." She looked down at the coffee mug, tracing its ceramic rim with her manicured finger. "I don't need another wealthy man in my orbit. What I need, what I have never actually had, is someone who makes me want to be a better, more honest version of myself." She stopped for a moment, the hesitation carrying the specific weight of a person who had reached the absolute edge of what they normally allowed themselves to say. The room was incredibly still. Outside, a delivery truck finally moved, and the street returned to its quiet rhythm. Ethan looked at the mostly empty coffee cup in front of her, and then looked directly into her eyes. "I believe you," Ethan said quietly. He did not offer grand promises, because pretending to know the future was a dishonesty he had stopped practicing. "But I think we should probably find out whether two people who know the heavy cost of building something can actually exist in the same room without one of them trying to repair the other."
This is where I draw the line.
Victoria listened, absorbing the absolute fairness of his condition. "That sounds reasonable," she finally replied. And then, Victoria Sterling almost smiled, an expression that for her was roughly equivalent to another person breaking down entirely. The tension broke. She looked around the raw space and asked if he had decided on a menu yet. Ethan replied that it was still a work in progress.
Thank you.
For the next hour, they sat together and talked simply about food, starting over, and building from the right place. The restaurant, now officially named Vance's, opened its doors exactly 6 weeks later on a quiet Tuesday evening. There was no press release, no soft launch event, and none of the elaborate trappings designed to announce a new venture. Ethan had funded the entire project himself, utilizing savings accumulated over 3 years of disciplined, quiet work. The final capital came from selling a piece of specialized tech equipment he had kept in storage from his previous life. He had not asked Victoria for a single dollar of investment, and she, honoring their agreement, had not offered one. That absolute absence of transaction made the entire structure feel solid to him in a way nothing he had built before ever had. Victoria arrived on opening night. She came on foot, wearing clothes that were unmistakably expensive but completely inconspicuous. She bypassed the bar and sat at the table by the front window, the one offering the best sightline to both the room and the street. She ordered directly from the menu he had written, ate the meal he had built, and offered absolutely no professional opinions. She was there simply as a guest, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply being a guest felt like exactly enough. A full year passed. Vance's quietly accumulated a 4-month waiting list, driven entirely by word of mouth and uncompromised quality. A prestigious dining publication eventually ran a feature, describing the unassuming spot as the most interesting new space in the city. Ethan found the lavish praise mildly embarrassing, though he quietly acknowledged the fundamental accuracy of the review. He did not frame the article for display. He simply folded it, placed it in a drawer in the back office, and returned to work. On a Thursday evening in late autumn, long after the final service had finished and the staff had gone home, Ethan and Victoria sat together at that same table by the front window.
It feels colder here than I expected.
The city moved outside the glass, indifferent and continuous, exactly the way it always had.
It's been too long.
There was an open bottle of dark wine on the table, alongside the remnants of a shared meal between them. Their conversation moved slowly, without any urgency, following whatever natural thread presented itself.
Perfect.
They spoke as two people who had completely stopped performing for each other, entirely comfortable in the silent spaces. Ethan looked around the room he had meticulously built from nothing, observing it in the quiet aftermath of a busy night. He had chosen the clean architectural lines, the solid oak, and the specific amber lighting to carefully set the emotional register of the space. It was undeniably his. Not in a defensive way, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had accurately manifested his own principles. Victoria shifted the conversation, mentioning a highly complex corporate acquisition she was navigating with a European conglomerate. She wasn't seeking validation. She was simply thinking aloud, mapping out the intricate variables of a high-stakes maneuver. Ethan listened with his usual absolute stillness, casually pouring the last of the dark red wine into her crystal glass. When she finally paused, he offered his perspective without hesitation, and without any desire to artificially soften his words. His view was uniquely valuable precisely because he stood entirely outside the massive gravity of her corporate world. He pointed out a structural flaw in her logic, a strategic blind spot created by her own close proximity to the deal. He did not defer to her immense expertise, and she, for the first time in her life, did not expect him to. That late autumn evening established a new baseline. There were no more walls to break down, and no more psychological tests to pass. As winter approached, Victoria became a quiet fixture at Vance's, arriving after hours when the chairs were stacked and the doors locked. They did not merge their lives in the traditional, messy sense. They maintained their distinct orbits, intersecting only when the day was done. In December, the European conglomerate launched a hostile countermaneuver, threatening to destabilize Sterling Capital's board of directors. The pressure was immense. Executive meetings stretched late into the night, the corporate atmosphere thick with panic and internal blame. Through it all, Victoria navigated the boardroom warfare with an unprecedented, icy calm that unnerved her oldest rivals. Her anchor was not her wealth, but the quiet conversations she shared over dark coffee at a wooden bar downtown. Meanwhile, a highly influential culinary critic visited Vance's incognito, expecting the standard obsequious treatment reserved for the elite. Ethan served the critic with the exact same unhurried, detached professionalism he offered to the neighborhood locals. He refused to perform, and that refusal to bow to the hierarchy of status became the defining signature of his establishment. Victoria executed her final counter-strategy 3 days before Christmas, systematically dismantling the European conglomerate's hostile bid. She did not maneuver with the loud arrogance of her past, but with a surgical, quiet precision that left her rivals with no viable countermove. The board of directors, expecting a dramatic and boastful victory speech, were met instead with her cold, matter-of-fact adjournment of the meeting. She had finally separated her inherent self-worth from her corporate victories, rendering her psychologically untouchable. The very next morning, the Incognito Critics' review of Vance's was published across major city networks. The extensive review praised the exceptional menu, but dedicated its largest paragraph to the uncompromising dignity of the establishment. Ethan read the review in his quiet back office, accepting the monumental success simply as a natural byproduct of his unyielding standards. Later that week, a massive, paralyzing blizzard swept across Manhattan, halting traffic and burying the city infrastructure in white. Victoria's luxury sedan was trapped several blocks away, its expensive engineering effectively useless against the overwhelming force of the winter storm. Choosing not to wait for clearance, she abandoned the warm vehicle and walked the remaining distance through the blinding, freezing snow. The blizzard showed no mercy, tearing through the narrow streets of the West Village. Victoria pushed forward, her determination overriding the biting, relentless cold. Through the blinding curtain of white, a solitary beacon emerged. The warm, amber glow of Vance's restaurant cut through the storm like a quiet sanctuary. She reached the heavy wooden door, her hands numb, and knocked firmly. The closed sign hung silently in the frosted window pane. Inside, Ethan was closing down the bar. The sharp sound of a knock against the glass momentarily broke the rhythmic hum of the heating system. He unbolted the door, stepping back to let the freezing wind and Victoria inside. His calm eyes registered the extremity of her journey instantly. As the heavy door clicked shut, the violent howling of the city was instantly replaced by the profound, insulated warmth of the oak room. Victoria shed her snow-covered coat, her breath still visible in the air. For the first time, she looked physically exhausted, yet completely at peace. Ethan moved with unhurried purpose, pouring a steaming cup of dark coffee and sliding it across the wood without demanding an explanation. They sat together near the frosted window, watching the city surrender to the storm. Inside, the environment remained perfectly controlled and deeply secure. There were no corporate strategies left to deploy, and no past failures left to defend. There was only the quiet truth of two equals. The blizzard raged through the night, effectively sealing the West Village off from the rest of the frantic city. Inside the oak-lined sanctuary, Ethan and Victoria did not discuss corporate mergers or past betrayals. They spoke of the quiet, deliberate mechanics of building a life that actually belonged to the person living it. By dawn, the storm had finally broken, leaving Manhattan buried under a thick, silencing blanket of pristine white snow. The morning light filtered through the frosted glass, illuminating two people who had found equilibrium. Victoria left shortly after sunrise, stepping back into the frozen streets, her posture completely devoid of its usual defensive armor. Ethan watched her go, locking the heavy door behind her, returning to the quiet, methodical preparation of his kitchen. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Capital stabilized, its board operating under a new, unshakable directive from its CEO. Victoria no longer approached negotiations as wars of attrition, but as calculated exchanges of equal value. And Vance's remained a fortress of uncompromising standards, completely immune to the fleeting trends of the city's elite. As winter dissolved into a crisp Manhattan spring, the rhythm of the city accelerated, driven by its endless cycle of ambition and consumption. Victoria observed the skyline from her executive suite. The city was still her domain, but it no longer served as the measure of her worth. Across town, Ethan continued his daily, rigorous routine. The perfection of his craft was not for public applause, but for his own internal standard. When evening fell, Victoria's luxury vehicle did not take her to the exclusive galas she once dominated. It took her downtown. She walked into Vance's with the quiet familiarity of a regular. The staff acknowledged her not as a titan of industry, but simply as a guest. Ethan poured her a glass of wine. Their exchange was brief, characterized by the profound silence of two people who understood each other implicitly. The space between them was no longer a negotiation table or a battlefield. It was simply a space, free from calculation or demand. They had both reached the apex of their respective worlds by stripping away the artificial layers of societal expectation. True autonomy, they had discovered, was not the ability to control the environment, but the profound capacity to remain unchanged by it. The warm amber glow of the restaurant burned steadily into the New York night, a quiet monument to a life deliberately and authentically lived.